Welcome to Mystery Archives. Hospitals are often seen as sanctuaries of healing, places where lives are saved and hope is restored. But there is a thinner, much darker line that separates the living from the departed within those sterile walls. When so much emotion, pain, and finality happens in one place, you have to wonder what gets left behind. Tonight, let the white hallways, the scent of antiseptic, and the empty rooms tell you their secrets. I have gathered 5 true, terrifying experiences from the darkest corners of the medical world. So turn off your lights, pull the blankets up to your chin, relax your mind, and let the shadows of Mystery Archives guide you into sleep. Our first story takes us to the forgotten wings of Oak Haven Military Hospital. I was serving as a night watchman at Oak Haven, a sprawling, 5-story relic built during the height of the Second World War. It was a massive brick fortress that felt completely out of place in the modern era. Because of budget cuts and a shrinking patient list, only the first and second floors remained active for patient care. The upper levels sat in absolute silence, sealed off and repurposed as storage. Those floors were a graveyard of extra chairs, discarded gurneys, and obsolete medical carts, gathering thick layers of dust in the dark. One quiet afternoon, long before my night shift began, my coworker, Arthur, and I needed an extra chair for the security desk. We decided to bypass the authorized personnel only signs taped crookedly to the heavy fire doors and make our way up to the deserted 4th floor. In its active years, the 4th floor had been the birthing ward and the nursery level. Stepping onto that floor felt like walking into a vacuum. The air was heavy, stale, and unnaturally cold. The walls were painted a fading, sickly pastel color that seemed to drain the light from our flashlights. We strolled down the long, empty corridor, our boots echoing loudly against the linoleum. Suddenly, a doorway caught us mid-stride. We both froze. I felt the breath catch in my throat. We exchanged quick, terrified glances, and I whispered to him, asking if he was seeing exactly what I was seeing. Arthur nodded slowly, his eyes wide and fixed on the center of the room. Sitting perfectly still in the middle of that abandoned hospital room was an old wooden rocking chair. But it wasn't empty. I glimpsed the vague, misty silhouette of a woman. She was swaying the rocker gently, pushing back and forth with a slow, hypnotic rhythm. The figure was hunched forward, her arms crossed tightly over her chest as if she were cradling something very small and very fragile close to her heart. Curiosity, combined with a strange sense of sorrow, pulled us back for a closer look. We took a step into the room. In the blink of an eye, the figure was gone. We were left staring at an empty wooden chair, still as a stone. There was no creaking of wood, no groaning of springs, and no retreating footsteps fading down the hall. There was absolutely no one else on the entire floor. Staff avoided the upper levels like the plague, only ever venturing up for rare supply runs. Shaken, we chalked it up to a trick of the light, or perhaps the deep fatigue of working too many long shifts. We grabbed a different chair from another room and hurried back downstairs. Weeks later, Arthur and I had to return to the 4th floor to retrieve some extension cables. As we walked down that same pastel-colored hallway, we passed that specific doorway again. This time, a handwritten note was taped to the wooden slats of the rocking chair. It caught my eye immediately. Written in thick, blocky black marker, with the words, "Please do not use or remove." It was odd enough that I decided to flag down our shift supervisor later that evening. I disrupted him while he was reviewing some charts at the main desk. When I mentioned the chair and the note on the 4th floor, his expression immediately darkened. He gave us a grim, tired look. He told us the history of that room. Decades ago, mothers used that exact wooden chair to rock their stillborn babies. They would sit in the quiet of that room, holding their silent children close, rocking them one last time before they had to let them go down to the morgue. My mind was entirely blown. The sorrow of his words washed over me like ice water. I realized then that we hadn't just seen a trick of the light. We had caught the residual spirit of a grieving mother, a form blurred by the passage of time, still trapped in her darkest hour. That confirmation proved to me that Oakhaven was truly haunted. But the tragic energy of that hospital seemed to cling to us even after we left. Much to my deep despair, tragedy struck not long after that encounter. My partner, Arthur, took his own life shortly after we were transferred to a gleaming, modern hospital across the state. I am not claiming that the rocking chair or the spirit of that grieving mother was directly connected to his passing. But witnessing my friend vanish from this world forever, after we had both peered through the veil of the afterlife together, affected me in ways that I will never fully be able to put into words. The echoes of that rocking chair still haunt my quietest nights. But grief is not the only thing that lingers in the sterile corridors of the medical world. Sometimes, the entities that remain are far more restless and far more demanding of our attention. Let us travel now across the ocean to a quiet imaging room in Catalonia, where a heavy lead-lined door is about to reveal that some things simply refuse to stay on the other side. Our second story takes us across the ocean, to the quiet, highly sanitized corridors of a public hospital in Catalonia, Spain. There is a unique kind of isolation that exists in the radiology department of any hospital. The walls are thicker, the lights are often kept dim to better view the glowing monitors, and the air always carries a faint, electric chill. This particular incident occurred in the deep winter of December 2019, but its shadow still heavily lingers over the doctor who experienced it. Dr. Elena was a seasoned radiologist, a woman of perfect health and a grounded, logical mind. She was not the type to imagine shadows in the corners or listen to ghost stories. But hospitals have a way of unraveling our logic. Late one evening, a close friend of hers had come in after hours for a routine mammography in the main imaging area. Once the procedure was finished, her friend retreated to the private changing booth to get dressed. Seeking a moment of quiet to analyze the results, Elena stepped into the adjacent space, known only as Room 4. Room 4 was isolated. To prevent any stray ionizing radiation from leaking into the public hallway, the room was sealed by incredibly heavy, lead-lined doors. These were not doors that could rattle in a draft. They required deliberate physical effort to open and close. Elena pushed the heavy doors shut, hearing the satisfying, airtight click of the latch locking into place. She sat down at her desk, bathing her tired face in the pale blue light of the computer monitor. The silence in the room was absolute. It was the kind of quiet that makes your ears ring. No more than 30 seconds had passed when the heavy, metallic doorknob suddenly began to twist. It wasn't a gentle turn. It was a violent, frantic rattling. Someone, or something, had gripped the handle firmly from the outside and was shaking it with such urgent, aggressive force that the entire heavy doorframe began to vibrate. Startled, but assuming her friend needed help or wanted to ask a quick question, Elena called out toward the door. "Come in," she said, her voice echoing slightly in the small room. But the door didn't open. The heavy knob just kept twisting and rattling, harder and faster, a metallic clatter that pierced the quiet of the ward. A flicker of annoyance washed over Elena. She raised her voice, shouting louder this time. "Come on in! It's open!" The rattling persisted for another long second before abruptly stopping. Complete silence rushed back into the room. And then logic caught up with Elena. A cold, creeping sensation trailed slowly down her spine. Her friend could not possibly be standing on the other side of that barrier. She had only just walked into the changing booth to put her clothes back on. There simply hadn't been enough time for her to dress and walk all the way down the hall. A strange, heavy certainty washed over the doctor. Her heart began to pound a slow, dreadful rhythm against her ribs. She stood up from her chair, her footsteps completely silent against the floor. She reached out, grasped the cold metal of the doorknob, twisted it herself, and pulled the heavy, lead-lined door wide open. She expected to see a prankster. She expected to see a late-night janitor. She saw nothing. The long, brightly lit hallway was utterly and completely empty. There were no retreating footsteps, no shadows slipping around the corner, just the endless, sterile white walls of the hospital staring back at her. As it turns out, Room 4 holds a dark reputation among the night staff. Other, deeply unsettling disturbances have plagued that exact space over the years. On another quiet night, Elena was sitting in that very room alongside two fellow doctors, silently reviewing patient scans. Out of the corner of their eyes, all three medical professionals watched as a heavy plastic bottle of echography gel suddenly launched itself off the counter. It didn't just fall. It flew through the air at an extreme, unnatural speed, smashing violently into the far wall before dropping to the floor. There was no one else in the room, no logical explanation. A colleague later confided in Elena, whispering what everyone on the staff already secretly knew, that something feels profoundly, fundamentally wrong with that entire floor. Whatever haunts that specific isolated corner of the hospital is angry, it is strong, and it wants to be acknowledged. But chilling encounters with the unseen are not just confined to the sterile, functioning wards of medical centers. Sometimes, the heavy grief of the past soaks into the very foundations of a building, refusing to leave even after the hospital beds are cleared away. Let us travel now to the sunny coast, to a grand, luxurious hotel that hides a deeply terrifying history. Sometimes, the shadows of the past don't just linger in the abandoned wards of forgotten military bases or the sterile corners of modern clinics. Sometimes, they hide in plain sight, wrapped in the facade of luxury and vacation. Our third story takes us to the sun-drenched coast of Florida, to a sprawling, historic hotel known as the Don CeSar. Today, it is a grand resort, its towering walls catching the ocean breeze. But buildings like this have long memories. For several years after its initial heyday, this massive structure was entirely repurposed. Its luxurious suites were stripped bare, the doors were locked from the outside, and it served as a mental hospital. Decades of anguish, confusion, and despair seeped into the floorboards before it was eventually closed, left vacant, and finally renovated back into a hotel. Around the year 2004, a man and his fiancée decided to take an extended weekend getaway to this very resort. They were looking for relaxation, completely unaware of the heavy history resting beneath the fresh paint and expensive carpets. They arrived late in the afternoon, weary from travel. Despite arriving well past check-in time, the front desk informed them their room was not yet ready. The staff was incredibly apologetic, inviting them to wait in the grand lounge and offering complimentary cocktails to pass the time. After about 45 minutes of quiet conversation over drinks, the concierge finally approached and handed them their keys. They made their way down the long, elegantly carpeted hallway. But the moment the man pushed open the heavy wooden door to their suite, a wall of thick, stagnant air hit him. The room reeked of stale cigarette smoke. It wasn't just a faint, lingering scent. It smelled as though someone had been chain-smoking in the dark with the windows sealed shut for days. The man was highly allergic to cigarette smoke. His throat immediately began to tighten, his chest growing heavy. He told his future wife to leave her bags by the door and not even bother unpacking. There was no way they could sleep in that room. He went back down to the lobby, politely explaining his severe allergy to the front desk and requesting a different, non-smoking room. The message was relayed to the manager on duty, who quickly came out from the back office. This is where things took a strange turn. The manager seemed unnervingly desperate to keep them in that specific room. He didn't offer an immediate apology or a quick room swap. Instead, he persistently tried to convince the man to stay, offering to send housekeeping up with heavy-duty air and carpet fresheners to mask the smell. But the man stood his ground, explaining that it was a serious medical issue. Reluctantly, the manager agreed. It took another long 45 minutes of waiting before a second room was finally prepared for them. When they walked into the new suite, the relief was instant. The air was crisp and clean, with absolutely no trace of smoke. The room offered a breathtaking, moonlit view of the dark ocean and the empty beach below. Above the bed hung a heavy wooden ceiling fan, controlled by a simple wall switch with 3 speeds. Exhausted from the strange delays of the day, they prepared for sleep. The man flipped the wall switch, setting the ceiling fan to its lowest, gentlest speed. A soft, rhythmic clicking began as the blades turned lazily, circulating the cool air. They climbed into bed, and the man quickly drifted off into a deep sleep. But the peace of the night did not last. Around 2 a.m, the man was pulled from his sleep by a deep, instinctual feeling of dread. His eyes snapped open in the pitch black. Something in the room was terribly wrong. The air conditioner was humming softly, but the temperature in the suite had plummeted. It was unnaturally, aggressively cold. The kind of cold that bites at your skin and sinks deep into your bones. And then he heard the sound above him. The ceiling fan, which he had explicitly set to a slow, lazy crawl, was now roaring. It was spinning with a violent, chaotic energy, moving so fast that the heavy wooden fixture was rattling against the ceiling. The motor whined and strained, a high-pitched mechanical scream echoing in the dark. Beside him, his fiancée remained completely still, trapped in an unnaturally deep sleep, completely undisturbed by the deafening noise. The man lay frozen on his back, watching the blurred blades spin faster and faster and faster. It reached a point where the entire fixture began to violently shake. It looked as though it was going to rip itself straight out of the plaster and come crashing down onto the bed. Pushing through his paralyzing fear, he threw off the covers, practically lunging across the freezing room to the wall switch. He slammed it down into the off position. But the fan did not stop. The switch was dead. The fan continued to spin at a breakneck, impossible speed, the motor screaming in the cold air. Trembling, the man backed away and climbed slowly back into bed. He closed his eyes tightly, pulling the sheets up, and began to silently pray. He focused all his energy into pushing back against whatever dark, heavy presence had filled the room. He prayed with every ounce of willpower he had. Slowly, agonizingly slowly, the whining of the motor began to fade. The violent shaking lessened. Over the next few minutes, as he continued his silent vigil, the fan began to decelerate, the blades finally slowing to a halt. The oppressive, freezing air lifted, leaving the room quiet once more. Exhausted and terrified, he somehow managed to slip back into sleep. When morning finally broke, the room was bathed in warm sunlight. The fan hung perfectly still above the bed. The terrifying energy of the night felt like nothing more than a bad dream. They got up and began preparing for the day. The man decided not to mention the terrifying incident to his fiancée, not wanting to ruin their vacation. He walked into the bathroom, turned on the warm water, and began to shave in front of the mirror. As the razor scraped against his skin, he paused. A voice cut through the sound of the running water. It didn't come from the hallway. It didn't come from the bedroom. It came directly from the other side of the bathroom wall. It was the raw, desperate voice of a man, muffled by the plaster, but entirely unmistakable. The voice screamed a single, agonizing phrase. "Get me out of here!" The razor slipped from his hand, clattering into the sink. The man stared at his own pale reflection in the mirror, his heart hammering against his ribs. Later that morning, before they checked out, he walked out into the hallway to investigate. He looked at the layout of the floor. There was no room abutting the other side of that bathroom wall. There was nothing but an exterior drop to the grounds below. Was it a residual echo? A memory of a desperate patient trapped within the walls of a mental hospital, forever crying out for an escape that would never come? The man believed so, and he never returned to the Pink Palace again. But sometimes, the echoes of the trapped and the desperate don't just speak through walls. Sometimes, they manipulate the very machinery designed to keep us alive. Let us travel now to the high altitudes of Quito, Ecuador, where an isolated ICU chamber during the darkest days of the pandemic is about to reveal that some forces cannot be kept out by locked doors. But sometimes, the echoes of the trapped and the desperate don't just speak through walls. Sometimes, they manipulate the very machinery designed to keep us alive. Let us travel now to the high altitudes of Quito, Ecuador, where an isolated ICU chamber during the darkest days of the global pandemic is about to reveal that some forces cannot be kept out by locked doors. Our fourth story takes us into the sterile mechanical heart of the Hospital Militar. The man who experienced this was not a medical doctor, but a systems engineer intern whose job was to maintain the life-saving equipment across the various intensive care units. He was a man of science and logic, someone who always tried to aggressively debunk strange occurrences before ever entertaining the idea of the paranormal. But in a hospital overflowing with grief, logic eventually finds its breaking point. It was a time of profound uncertainty and relentless exhaustion, where early COVID-19 patients filled the beds. The work was grueling, demanding constant, high-stakes troubleshooting of ventilators amid a never-ending symphony of beeping alarms. To manage the crisis, the hospital had rapidly constructed a specialized isolation chamber within the main ICU. This sealed plastic enclosure was designed specifically for highly contagious cases, connected to the main ward only by a narrow, claustrophobic passage. It was just wide enough for one person, fully clad in suffocating personal protective equipment, to squeeze through. The air inside was thick and heavy with the constant droning whir of negative pressure fans, aggressively sucking the air inward to prevent any microscopic contamination from escaping into the rest of the building. Security and containment were paramount. The heavy doors to this chamber were governed by highly specific motion sensors. You could not simply brush past them, and individual fingers failed to trigger the mechanism entirely. They required a full, open hand, waved deliberately and closely in front of the optical lens to open. Once inside, the heavy glass panels would automatically slide shut after exactly 10 seconds, completely sealing the room. To leave, you had to repeat the exact same deliberate, full-handed gesture from the inside. On one particularly grim afternoon, the engineer found himself working deep inside this sealed chamber. He was standing about 4 meters away from the heavy entrance doors, focused entirely on calibrating a ventilator under the faint, unnatural buzzing of the overhead strip lighting. Across the room, a cluster of nurses was frantically tending to a struggling patient. The monitors around them were flashing an urgent, blinding red. Everyone's attention was entirely consumed by the critical fight for life. With his back turned to the main passage, the engineer was deeply engrossed in the digital display of his machine. And then he heard it. A sharp, pneumatic hiss. He turned around and watched in absolute shock as the heavy entrance panel smoothly slid open entirely on its own. He was standing well beyond the range of the sensors. There was absolutely no motion nearby to trip the optical beam. He peered out into the passage and the main ward beyond, where a line of empty beds sat in the dim light. There were no staff members shuffling through. There was no doctor, no nurse, and no living soul near that door to deliberately wave a full hand in front of the sensor. Yet the heavy panel remained wide open. It stayed completely ajar the entire time he finished his diagnostics and slowly packed his toolkit, the steady, eerie whoosh of the negative pressure fans filling the quiet space. At the time, he desperately tried to brush it off as a mere sensor glitch, a faulty wire in a rushed pandemic installation. But the unease settled deep in his stomach like a heavy stone. Later, seeking some logical comfort, he mentioned the bizarre incident to a nurse friend named Maria, who worked on that exact floor. Instead of reassuring him, Maria's face went pale. She confirmed that the maintenance team had recently verified all the gates, finding them to be working perfectly with 0 faults logged in the entire system. But that wasn't the most chilling part. She leaned in close and told him about the night team's experiences. In the dead of night, when the ward was mostly quiet, the nurses had reported ventilators suddenly powering on entirely by themselves. They heard sudden, unexplained beeps from empty rooms, and, most terrifying of all, echoing from the sterile, abandoned corners of the ward where there was no one around. They heard the unmistakable, high-pitched laughter of unseen children. The staff all quietly agreed on one terrifying fact. These strange, impossible occurrences had surged and grown intensely strong right after the patients in that ward had started dying. One by one, their final breaths exhaled into the cold, recycled air of the isolation chamber. When the final breath leaves a body, it seems the hospital itself absorbs the shock. But what happens when that lingering energy refuses to stay confined to a single room? Let us travel next to a small, rural district hospital, where the long, dimly lit subterranean corridors hide something that loves to follow you in the dark. When the final breath leaves a body, it seems the hospital itself absorbs the shock. But what happens when that lingering energy refuses to stay confined to a single room? Let us travel next to a small, rural district hospital, where the long, dimly lit subterranean corridors hide something that loves to follow you in the dark. Our final story of the night brings us to an isolated medical center where a solitary doctor worked the graveyard shift as the only on-site physician. The architecture of this particular hospital was strange, built directly into the sloping side of a hill. While the emergency department sat comfortably at ground level, reaching the medical and surgical wards required a lonely journey. You had to walk down a long, sloping corridor that descended deep into the cool, windowless basement spaces at the far end of the property. One quiet night, a pager beep summoned the doctor to the lower wards. He found himself hurrying alone along that dimly lit passage, walking directly under the empty outpatient area. The silence down there was heavy, broken only by the sound of his own footsteps echoing off the tiled walls. Halfway through the tunnel, the temperature seemed to drop. An overwhelming, suffocating pressure suddenly pressed into the back of his neck. It wasn't just a fleeting feeling of being watched. It was a stare of such dark intensity that every primal instinct in his body screamed that he was in immediate danger. The shadowed stretch of hallway ahead seemed to swallow the light. Unable to shake the paralyzing dread, he broke into a sprint, abandoning the wait for the elevator and taking the stairs 2 at a time. The suffocating pressure only lifted when he finally pushed through the doors, and the fresh air of the upper level hit his face. He later learned a chilling piece of history about that specific route. Years earlier, before renovations had moved it, the hospital's morgue had lined that exact subterranean corridor. He never walked that path alone at night again. But avoiding the basement doesn't mean avoiding the dead. On another deeply unsettling night in the emergency department, a critically ill elderly man in the clinical decisions unit went into cardiac arrest. Despite their best efforts, he passed away peacefully around 11 o'clock that evening. His body was moved, and his room was left perfectly silent and completely empty. The ward settled into the deep, still hours of the night. Around 4 in the morning, the doctor was sitting quietly at the nurse's station. He happened to glance down the hall toward the deceased man's empty room. Beneath the closed door, a strange light was slowly brightening. It crept across the floor like the first pale rays of dawn filtering through the blinds, growing steadily more intense. Moments later, the heavy door clicked loudly and swung open entirely by itself. It wasn't sunlight spilling into the hallway. It was the harsh, blood-red glow of the emergency lighting. The backup lights had been triggered solely inside that one specific room, despite the main electrical power staying completely steady everywhere else in the building. No outages were reported, and not a single other emergency light had activated along the entire unit. Before anyone could investigate, the electronic access doors to the entire department suddenly failed. The heavy security locks engaged with a solid thud, trapping the entire night staff inside the unit. The air grew thick and tense. Trying to break the heavy silence, one of the nurses nervously joked that they had forgotten to open the deceased man's window to allow his spirit to escape. Hoping to ease the tension, she walked over and cracked the window wide open into the cold night air. Exactly 5 minutes later, a deafening alarm blared through the ward. It wasn't coming from the man's room. It was coming from the far isolation room at the end of the hall, a room no one had stepped foot in all evening. The alarm indicated a critical breach. The negative pressure airlock, designed to contain deadly pathogens, had suddenly tripped. The system failed because both of the heavy, sealed doors to the isolation room had been thrown wide open. The staff cautiously approached the blaring room, peering into the empty space. There was no patient inside. There was no living soul. The only thing sitting in the center of that breached isolation room was the deceased elderly man's stored mobility scooter. He had found his way out. The hospital corridors have finally fallen silent. The night shift log is closed, and the shadows have retreated to the corners of the wards. If these stories from Mystery Archives have guided you through the dark tonight, please leave a like and subscribe to the channel so we can meet again in the quiet hours. But for now, the darkness belongs entirely to you. There is nothing left to fear. Close your eyes, breathe in the quiet, and sleep well.